There's something unsettling about old maps, not because they're inaccurate, but because sometimes they're too accurate in the wrong places. You can spend hours looking through maps from the 1500s and 1600s and notice something strange. Entire islands, massive land masses, detailed coastlines, all sitting in regions where today we're told nothing exists. And nowhere is this stranger than the far north, the North Pole. Because according to many old maps, the Arctic wasn't just ice, it was alive, filled with islands, passages, territories, and names that have since disappeared completely. One of the strangest of them all was Friesland, an island shown repeatedly across maps from the 1500s through the 1600s. Not once, not accidentally, but over and over again by different cartographers across Europe. And that raises a question people still can't answer properly. How does an island that never existed appear consistently for over a century? Because these weren't rough sketches made by isolated sailors. These were official maps, used by explorers, merchants, governments, maps people trusted with their lives. And once you begin studying the old Arctic maps, you realize something even stranger. Friesland wasn't the only thing that disappeared. When most people picture the North Pole today, they imagine emptiness, ice, snow, an uninhabitable wasteland with nothing beyond frozen ocean. But that's not what older maps show at all. The farther back you go, especially into the 1500s and early 1600s, the more detailed the Arctic becomes. And that alone is odd, because according to mainstream history, these regions were barely understood. Exploration was limited, navigation was dangerous. Yet somehow, cartographers were drawing incredibly specific northern territories with confidence. Not vague shapes, not random guesses. Structured coastlines, named islands, circular land formations surrounding the pole itself. Some maps even depict massive openings or central polar regions divided by waterways, almost like the Arctic wasn't a dead zone, but a functioning region people already knew about. And then there's the detail that changes everything. Many of these maps don't treat the far north as mysterious. They treat it as familiar. That's what stands out the most. The confidence, the certainty, as though whoever created these maps wasn't imagining these places, but copying from older source material. And that idea becomes even more unsettling when you learn how many cartographers referenced earlier maps we no longer possess. Lost source maps, ancient records, documents supposedly copied and recopied over generations, which means the Arctic shown in the 1500s may not have originated in the 1500s at all. It may have been inherited from a much older world. Out of all the lost northern territories, Friesland stands above the rest. Because unlike tiny phantom islands drawn once by mistake, Friesland became established. It appeared across maps from the 1560s through the 1660s. That's over 100 years of repeated acknowledgement. Different cartographers, different nations, different map styles. Yet the island remained, large, detailed, placed consistently in the North Atlantic between Iceland and Greenland. And what's fascinating is how seriously it was taken. Explorers referenced it, sailors expected to find it, trade routes were influenced by its existence. This wasn't treated like folklore, it was geography, which raises the obvious question. How could generations of professional map makers all make the exact same mistake, especially in an era where maps determined survival? One wrong coastline could destroy an expedition, and yet Friesland survived on maps for over a century before quietly disappearing, not publicly corrected, not dramatically exposed as false, just removed, almost as if the world itself changed. Or the information people once had access to suddenly became unavailable. And that's where the theories surrounding the North Pole begin taking a darker turn. Because some researchers believe places like Friesland weren't imaginary at all. They believe these islands existed during an earlier era, before catastrophic events reshaped the northern world. An older Arctic, a pre-reset Arctic, one connected to Tartaria itself. The deeper you go into old northern maps, the more Tartaria begins appearing around them. Massive northern territories, regions stretching across Siberia and beyond. And strangely enough, many of these maps connect Tartaria directly to the Arctic world, not as isolated wasteland, but as active territory. Trade routes appear, northern sea passages are marked. Some maps even suggest populated or navigable regions near the pole itself. And this creates a possibility most people never consider. What if the North Pole wasn't always frozen the way it is today? What if earlier civilizations accessed regions we no longer can? Because if Tartaria truly possessed advanced knowledge, especially involving resonance, navigation, and energy systems, then controlling harsh northern climates may not have been impossible for them. And that changes the entire meaning of these maps, because now they stop looking like fantasy and start looking like records from a world operating under completely different conditions. A world before collapse, before whatever happened in the north transformed it permanently. Some of the strangest Arctic maps ever created show something so unusual that most people dismiss it immediately. Not because it's impossible, but because it's too specific, too structured. Again and again, old northern maps depict the polar region divided into 4 enormous landmasses surrounding a central point. Not random islands scattered across open ocean, a deliberate formation. Separated by massive rivers or channels that all flow inward toward the center of the pole itself. And in the middle, a black mountain, a magnetic mountain, according to some of the older descriptions. A place associated with strange currents, unusual navigation behavior, and forces that supposedly interfered with compasses long before modern technology existed. At first glance, it sounds mythical, until you realize how many cartographers repeated the same design, especially after the work of Gerardus Mercator, and that's what makes it difficult to ignore. Because cartographers in the 1500s and 1600s weren't simply artists, they were compilers of knowledge. Many of them copied from earlier maps we no longer possess, ancient maritime records, travel documents, fragments passed down through generations, which means the strange polar design may not have originated in Mercator's era at all. It may have come from something much older, a preserved memory of a northern world that existed before catastrophe changed it completely. And when you really study those maps, you notice something else. The Arctic regions shown there don't resemble frozen wasteland. They resemble functioning territory, navigable waterways, structured coastlines, named regions. The entire presentation feels active, alive, not buried beneath miles of permanent ice. And that's where the official narrative begins to feel weak. Because we're told the North Pole has essentially existed in frozen isolation for immense stretches of history. Yet these older maps portray something radically different. Not just less ice, but an entirely different environment. And the scale of that difference matters, because ice at the modern polar level doesn't simply appear overnight, especially not thick continental ice capable of burying entire regions, coastlines, and possibly civilizations. Something massive would have had to happen. A catastrophe, an environmental shift so severe it permanently transformed the northern world. Because when you compare the old depictions to the modern Arctic, it doesn't feel like gradual change. It feels sudden, like the maps preserve memory from before the freeze fully took hold, before the northern world was sealed beneath ice. And if that's true, then those strange polar islands may not have been symbolic at all. They may have been the last recorded glimpse of a world humanity lost.
The deeper you go into old Arctic records, the harder it becomes to believe the North Pole was always frozen the way it is today. Because the amount of ice covering the polar regions now is enormous. Not just seasonal ice, layered ice, ancient ice, miles of compressed accumulation in some regions. And mainstream explanations tell us this developed gradually over extremely long periods of time. But when you compare that explanation to the older maps, something doesn't align. Because the maps don't depict a world entering catastrophe. They depict a world before catastrophe, a functioning northern environment. And if those maps were based on inherited knowledge, then at some point, conditions changed dramatically enough to erase entire territories beneath ice and sea. That kind of transformation doesn't happen quietly. It requires violence, massive shifts in climate, volcanic activity, seismic instability, possibly even pole displacement itself. And what's interesting is how many ancient traditions from completely different cultures describe a great freezing or a northern destruction event. Stories of lands becoming unreachable, civilizations swallowed by cold. Even the idea of a lost northern kingdom appears repeatedly throughout older mythologies. Different names, different cultures, but similar themes. And maybe those stories weren't symbolic. Maybe they were memories, distorted over generations, yes, but still rooted in real events. Because imagine what it would actually take to bury entire regions beneath permanent ice. Not just snowstorms, not ordinary winters, but catastrophic environmental collapse. The kind capable of reshaping oceans, coastlines, and atmospheric systems all at once. And suddenly, the Arctic maps begin making more sense. Not as fantasies, but as records from before the collapse fully completed. Before the northern world became inaccessible. Before entire islands like Friesland vanished from practical human experience. And this idea becomes even more unsettling when connected to Tartaria, because many old maps place Tartarian territories remarkably close to these northern regions. Trade routes extend upward, northern passages appear active, almost as though Tartaria wasn't isolated from the Arctic, but deeply connected to it. And if Tartaria truly possessed advanced knowledge or environmental technologies, it's possible the north was once far more habitable than we're told, until the catastrophe changed everything.
Whatever happened in the far north, it wasn't small, because the evidence left behind points toward transformation on a planetary scale. Entire coastlines changed, sea ice expanded, regions once mapped confidently became inaccessible or impossible to verify. And this transition seems to happen far too abruptly to fit the slow, stable progression we're usually taught. That's why so many older northern maps feel eerie. They look like memories from before disaster, not primitive guesses about unexplored land. And once you start viewing them through that lens, the details become chilling. Because many of these maps preserve signs of organization in the Arctic, not random wilderness, structured geography, named locations, navigable routes, almost like the North once functioned as part of a larger connected world system. Then suddenly, that system collapses, and afterward, the surviving generations inherit only fragments, stories, maps, legends of unreachable northern lands, which is exactly what you would expect after a massive catastrophe, especially one severe enough to permanently freeze enormous portions of the planet. And maybe that's why so many ancient cultures describe floods, darkness, fire from the sky, or prolonged winters all within overlapping timelines, because they may have been witnessing the same global event from different perspectives. A reset, not just political, not just societal, environmental, planetary. And if that catastrophe truly reshaped the North Pole, then the frozen Arctic we know today may not be the natural state of the world at all. It may be the scar left behind after something ancient collapsed.
And maybe that explains why the far north feels so controlled even today. Because for a place supposedly empty and lifeless, the Arctic receives an unusual amount of attention. Military presence, restricted zones, monitored expeditions. Entire regions where civilian access remains heavily limited. And officially, the reasons sound practical. Dangerous weather, harsh conditions, environmental protection. But once you study the old maps, those explanations start feeling incomplete. Because centuries ago, people appeared to know far more about the Arctic than we supposedly know now. Not less. More. That contradiction is difficult to ignore. How does humanity become technologically advanced enough to reach space, yet simultaneously lose detailed understanding of regions earlier civilizations mapped confidently? Especially when many of those earlier maps align surprisingly well with actual coastlines outside the polar regions. Meaning, the cartographers weren't incompetent. They clearly possessed real geographic knowledge. So why does the Arctic become the one place where history suddenly claims they were imagining things? That question sits at the center of everything. Because if the old maps preserve memory from before catastrophe, then modern society may not just be hiding geography, it may be hiding history itself. The memory of a northern world that existed before the freeze, before the collapse, before the ice sealed everything beneath it.
Maybe the old maps were wrong. Maybe generations of cartographers all imagined the same islands, coastlines, and polar structures for over a century by coincidence. Maybe Friesland never existed. Maybe the 4 islands surrounding the pole were only symbolic. Maybe the Arctic was always just endless ice. But the deeper you look, the harder that becomes to believe. Because the old maps carry something modern explanations struggle to erase. Consistency, confidence, memory. They depict a North Pole that feels alive, connected, part of a functioning world rather than a frozen void. And perhaps most importantly, they depict a world before catastrophe transformed it forever. Because ice on that scale doesn't feel natural, not when compared to the older records, not when entire territories disappear beneath it, not when civilizations tied to the far north vanish from memory at the same time. Something happened. Something powerful enough to bury landscapes, alter climates, and fracture humanity's understanding of its own past. And maybe the reason the Arctic still fascinates people today is because deep down, it doesn't feel empty. It feels hidden, like beneath the ice, beneath the silence, beneath centuries of rewritten history. Something from the old world still remains.